Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking, why? But there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us, and is what we will remember in the end. These are the opening words of the 2010 Remedy video game Alan Wake, and with its very first line, it sets the stage of a prolonged question that asks, what if we took Tyrion's horrible importance of story speech from the last episode of Game of Thrones, and adapted it into a video game? For a story that is about stories, and what it means to tell a story and to craft a story, the basic setup is quite simple. Alan Wake is a best-selling American novelist who has suffered for the past 2 years with writer's block after a near-nervous breakdown due to the James Patterson-like success of his pop fiction Alex Casey detective novels. He has gone on a retreat with his wife, Alice, to the small Pacific Northwest town of Bright Falls, something that which he thinks is a short vacation to get away, but Alice has other plans for him. She intends it to be a refresh to give him that much-needed spark again. But as soon as they arrive in a supernatural incident, Alice is swallowed by the nearby lake, which is implied to be alive. And once darkness descends in the night, the townsfolk of Bright Falls transform into shadowy, murderous, demonic entities, who seem to be hunting down Alan specifically. And against his will, Alan finds himself trapped in a plot that could be ripped straight from the pages of one of his books. As artists, I truly believe that we can learn a lot more about writing and creating art from dissecting flawed works than we can from masterpieces. Sometimes seeing where something fell off or went wrong is all that we need to figure out how to do something in a more creative and effective way within our own work. I don't think that there's a great deal that you can actually learn about writing comics from reading The Killing Joke, for instance. But The Three Jokers is a wellspring of knowledge of how not to do something. The Three Jokers is really an example of something created by someone who learned how to write just from reading old Alan Moore comics. And also, just as a side note, Alan Moore has in the past described Jeff Johns, the writer of that book, as a parasite and a raccoon that constantly shifts through his garbage in the dead of night. And I just find that very funny. And he said that before Johns ever wrote Doomsday Clock or Three Jokers, which serve as direct sequels to his books, both in style and in story. But before we get to that, we should start with some of the positives and a breakdown of the core gameplay. Alan Wake is a game rich with atmosphere, and it does this really well. It easily stands out among the best of that console generation and even holds up today in that department. The artistry there is near unparalleled. The footage you are seeing in this video is from the recent PS5 remaster of the game, but everything that I'm saying is applied to the base 360 version as well. The music swells with an impressive soundtrack, consisting of both a very effective original orchestral score and pre-existing songs to fit the tone. The wind howls, shaking trees and groaning their trunks. The darkness of evening seeps into muddled black pools, and the wooded pathways become more treacherous as nighttime descends. Alan's paranoia manifests with bizarre visions through televisions and independently moving furniture. It's great stuff. Not only are the woods impressively done, but every location that you will visit in this game is rendered with such an authentic commitment to detail that you will often find yourselves standing still, just looking off into the horizon. Everywhere that you go, there are blackbirds flying around and watching you from posts. You later learn that the birds are working for the dark presence that is hunting Alan, and that they can swarm you as mini-boss fights, which leaves the forest feeling like it is full of spies that always have their eyes on you in a fun way similar to the spies of Isengard and Saruman. The game directly references Lord of the Rings several times, and I imagine this concept is taken directly from that. But it works and is subtle enough so I don't really mind it compared to a lot of the other references the game outright makes. I'm also a big fan of environmental and in-universe graphic designs in games. If you give me a lot of signs for fake businesses to look at and read on streets, then I will take a lot of time to do that as a player, which is something that Alan Wake exceeds at. Every environment feels decorated in ways that feel thoughtful and purposeful. The design people went crazy with a lot of these interiors, and while it frequently is relying too heavily on Twin Peaks iconography, which is something that seeps into every aspect here, even down to the blankets on beds. It's clear that a greater eye to how a room should feel when entering it was used than on most 360-era games. Really, an attention to detail in general is the core design thesis for the look of Alan Wake. I do have to place a complaint here though, in relation to the recent remaster that I'm using footage for. In their 2019 game Control, there are these little live-action flashes that can happen. They give emotional and information-based bits of context to what is going on. These are not in the original Alan Wake, but they have added them here for the remaster. But for some reason, instead of actually inserting them into the game, they ruin the atmosphere of some of these rooms by just having giant QR codes on the wall for you to scan with your real-life phone, which will then take you to a YouTube link to watch them and then pretend like they were a part of the game. It's a bafflingly stupid solution to a fake problem, and if they wanted them in here, they should have either inserted them or left them out. It's their game after all. People who have never played this before would be so confused as to why Alan has just a massive QR poster on the walls of his office. The base idea of the gameplay also is mainly what the title is known for, and while it is not explored to the fullest extent that it could be, it is a pretty unique idea. It takes its over-the-shoulder camera function from Remedy's previous title, Max Payne, as well as hints of improvements from Resident Evil 4. It is the same type of camera setup they would later use in Quantum Break and Control, and while it is near perfected in Control and feels great to use, here it feels a little awkward at times. It's just slightly too far from Alan, which can make him feel a bit floaty, and sometimes can get caught on something when you're in a corner leading to some unfair hits while in combat. I don't know exactly what all is off about it. I just know that it doesn't feel right to play, and that is always a bad sign. The driving also is really horrible. It's not quite as bad as it is in Cyberpunk, but it doesn't feel good at all, which is a massive shame because I would love to get in Alan's car or truck and just drive through this impressive landscape that they have designed here while listening to the radio. It is often my favorite thing to do in these types of games, and the fact that you can't here, despite an open world being designed, is a massive shame. Luckily or unluckily, there isn't much driving in this at all, so you don't have to deal with it a lot, and I would rather have it here than not, because it is fun enough when you get the chance to do it, even if it feels frustrating at times, as well as having the added benefit of adding variation to the gameplay. We will get to this in a moment, but the driving aspects in this almost certainly were not finished or polished to the degree that they would have liked, but were functionable enough at least to include in these small, short snippets of levels. Within combat, the gunplay is not the most important thing going on here. Alan's most powerful weapon is his flashlight, which he uses to expel the darkness from his enemies, which cannot even be damaged with bullets before he does this. And he can use lights, not only from his flashlight, but also his flare gun, and other environmental objects to his advantage, creating a resource management system where not only do you have to worry about your ammunition and health, but also how many batteries you have left to power your lights. There's also a dodge that can be used right before an enemy attacks that works very similar to the one from the recent Resident Evil 3 remake, although the timing is a little bit more forgiving here. And when you do time it absolutely perfectly, it goes into slow motion cinematic mode, which is always satisfying. There are, however, some deeply frustrating elements to certain aspects of the control scheme. Sometimes, when you pick up ammunition for a weapon, the game will, for some bizarre reason, automatically switch your held gun to whatever weapon you just picked up for, meaning that you frequently end up wasting ammunition for your better guns because you didn't realize that the game had switched them on you without telling you. Such as here where I waste a flare on a single enemy when I thought I had my pistol out. I also think that A on the Xbox controller and X on the PlayStation controller should be the universal prompt to click on something, but in Alan Wake it is B or circle, meaning that often when you try to click on something through muscle memory, you will hit the wrong button, and Alan just stands and jumps in place like an idiot. The lighting in this game is so gorgeous that it is still stunning today. Even the base game is shockingly good in this department. As we will see in a minute, an entirely new lighting system had to be developed just to pull this off. But that being said, the lighting could have been pushed a lot farther from a gameplay perspective. You never have an instance where you can flip on a light switch in a room and take out several guys at once. It feels very limited in how many ways they allow you to play with the lights in combat, And that feeling can also be said of combat in general. Every area feels like there is only one single way to handle what the game throws at you. And after a while, fighting starts to feel like an endless wave of repetitive, repeating enemies in a horde mode. But to give it the benefit of the doubt, more than likely, many of these issues were hardware limitations. I have read just getting the flashlight to work properly on the 360 was no small task. And I imagine in a perfect world with unlimited resources and time, they would have liked to incorporate more options for creative light uses and combat options. Ultimately, Alan Wake is a game about story and the very act of writing. And for a game that is about story and writing and character, it understands little of what it is trying to engage with, or at least is unable to do so through the medium of being a game. Alan Wake as a character is a bad pulp writer. It is pretty much a reoccurring joke throughout the story that he is very tropey and not particularly good, even though he sells a lot of copies, and is popular. The argument could be made that Alan Wake as a game is trying to play with these ideas, while also at the same time falling short into the same traps of pop writing the titular character befalls. And some could argue that that is the point, but I would ask those people, to what end? Emulating low-tier tropes and doing nothing new with them is still just the same thing. There's nothing transformative there. This is a problem with Remedy games in general in my opinion, and it kind of baffles me. They are obviously inspired by non-video game works. They've had 2 titles based around the concept of being a video game and a television show combined, one of which is based around horror novels. There is such a deep well to draw from. But for people who seem to want to dissect and engage with the art form of long-form storytelling, as you can see here in what we're going to discuss with the game's narrative, they seem to have little interest in actually telling a coherent, long-form story. I feel that most games are slightly terrified of actually telling a story, or having cutscenes that last longer than a minute or 2 at a time. One of my biggest criticisms of 2018's Spider-Man is that you could tell that the developers were anxious if there was a single moment of downtime to progress the story, without a building exploding or something. I think the birthday party scene is probably the worst in that whole game, and is also one of the first that you experience. It left a really bad taste in my mouth the first time I saw it, and it tainted the next few hours of the game for me. In one scene that is less than 3 minutes long, we have to establish that MJ and Peter are no longer together. We have to introduce the main villain, show Aunt May's ordinary life, where she works and her relationship to Peter, and how she worked to put him through college, and also have it be her birthday party all at the same time. And Peter doesn't even stay for the party because being Spider-Man is a full-time job, so he leaves pretty much the second it starts. It is okay for scenes to accomplish and juggle multiple ideas in the same moment. Economy of time is a strong writing skill. But Peter isn't allowed to just go to his aunt's birthday. There isn't a single scene in the game where he just checks on the most important person in his life, just to make sure that she's doing okay with everything going on in the world, without the scene also trying to do a bunch of other different Spider-Man related things that have absolutely no real connection to their relationship with each other as people. Which makes her death feel hollow, because we only know her as a device whose scenes are only used to push the plot forward for Spider-Man, rather than seeing her as an actual human being that Peter cares for. I went through and counted, and she's only in this game for about 12 minutes. The average player will take 17 to 25 hours to finish it, and she is intended to be the emotional through line of that. The person Peter Parker, who gives meaning to the Spider-Man identity, cannot be explored, because it is too rigidly attached to the standards dictated by what is expected of an action video game. This unwillingness to slow the pace to give emotional information with a story is a major problem that has stunted video games as a medium for decades, and can be felt throughout the entirety of Alan Wake, especially considering that most of the dialogue in the game is talking about story and the act of story, writing, and the creative process. On paper, Remedy games seem like they would be the exact sort of thing that I love. A neo-noir action shooter detective mystery, a horror Stephen King and Twin Peaks inspired game set in the Pacific Northwest, a hard sci-fi television-styled story-based game centered around the idea of time manipulation, an X-Files SCP-based secret mysterious government organization that contains powerful, mystical objects which need to be explored. All very cool ideas. but everything that they do is a pastiche of greater things, an imperfect clone. If you're not aware, Twin Peaks is an early American 90s television show that's cultural impact is incalculable. It is almost impossible at this point to write a story that focuses on a small town without playing with tropes that were either developed or popularized by Stephen King or Twin Peaks. It is my personal favorite single piece of media, and is something that I and a great deal of others hold great reverence for. And as artists, this reverence is important to recognize and show self-restraint so that it does not pollute your own work. As this really gross thing has happened in the past 30 years or so, where some works emulate Twin Peaks and Lynch to a point of just being a worse version of that, with little to no artistic ingenuity or integrity behind it. They have, more or less with Alan Wake, constructed a world here entirely of visual references stolen whole cloth from Twin Peaks. As a game, it has no visual or textual identity that belongs to itself. With the name of the town Bright Falls, they are trying to signal to you what this is, which is a lesser version of that thing that you know. Instead of the Double R Diner, they have the Triple D Diner. From Allen's Island, you can clearly see the Great Northern Lodge, which here is the Cauldron Lake Lodge. The sheriff's station is here. They even have their own version of the log lady called the Lamp Lady. But there's no substance to it. It's Walmart brand Lynch, which is a disgusting sentence to have to write. I'm almost shocked that they had the personal restraint to avoid Alan going to sleep at night and waking up in the Red Room, except now it's purple so that they won't get sued. And this is far from the only reference in the game. Alan throughout the campaign watches episodes of a TV show called Night Springs, a pun based on the town name as when Bright Falls, Night Springs, which acts as a parody to The Twilight Zone. The dark presence that possesses the town was intended to be a riff on the smoke monster from Lost, with how it knocks down trees in the distance. Dialogue in the game directly references Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Birds, Deliverance, The Shining, Rambo, Lord of the Rings, Vertigo, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the Evil Dead films, among a few others that I have probably missed. Also, the townspeople of Bright Falls turning into shadow monsters are essentially just the Deadites from Evil Dead. There is no way to play these sequences and not be thinking about Twin Peaks the whole time in a distracting way that stands between you and the scene. Just whole scenes in this game can only be described as a bad meme. Take a show like Atlanta, another work that heavily riffs on what Twin Peaks did, but does it so smoothly that most people in the audience wouldn't even notice. In the 8th episode titled The Club, Earn is going after this guy to get money that he is owed. The scene is lit in red, and the club music is so loud that you can't hear their voices, and it has to be subtitled. And just in general has a very ominous feel to it. Just like how in Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, in the red-lit club sequence the music is so loud and the voices are so muffled that subtitles have to guide you through the scene. In another episode, there's a student in ISS that is in trouble for doing whiteface, doing a very unnerving look at the camera, who at least to me is quite reminiscent to the energy of Twin Peaks' Jumping Man. Ahmed White, the man who appears to Earn on the bus in his dream, as well as in an otherworldly commercial in a different episode, has some visual and character similarities to the Twin Peaks giant, but none of this is overt. These are just flavors. They are clear references, but are more clever in what they're trying to do. They're not overbearing, and do not stand in the way so jarringly that prevents you from engaging with it as a work of art as an audience member. It is simply an acknowledgement of what came before and a work that is building off of that, not just an empty, soulless recreation. How it is done here in Alan Wake is essentially my least favorite style of writing, and is something that I detest that has come about significantly in the past 15 years. Do you know that horrible, "Hey you guys" commercial that plays before each movie at the Regal, where people are getting to their seats but live in some nightmare reality, where they can only talk in old movie lines, where they're just saying things without context at each other that only kind of make sense instead of engaging with each other like people. And these things only make sense because we've seen the movies that they're quoting. That's how this style of writing that Alan Wake uses feels like to me. Just an endless nauseating list of, do you remember this? How about this? Do you remember this? How about this? Do you remember this? How about this? I would argue that Remedy probably still has not outgrown this style of referential writing, which is unfortunate. as while I was making this video, they announced that they had changed the company logo with an Alan Wake-themed forest image from the upcoming sequel. And hanging from the trees are the stick figures from the Blair Witch Project. But they're in the shape of little W's that stand for Wake, which is honestly just extremely goofy. But think about it for a moment. What could this possibly communicate to you as an audience member other than the question, hey, do you remember the Blair Witch Project? There's no substance to something like this beyond the artifice. Even though there are many references to the work of Stephen King in the game, including the very opening line spoken, I've always thought that the most influential work on it is one of King's novels that is never actually referenced within it, Salem's Lot. It tells the story of popular novelist Ben Mears, who, after losing his wife and going through a bout of writer's block as a result of that event, goes to the quiet, sleepy town of Jerusalem's Lot to try and find his voice again. The opening section of the novel features Ben having several run-ins with the locals of the hamlet, most of which are at least aware of who he is, and a few of which are great admirers of his work. It essentially starts out with the premise of, what if Stephen King moved to a small town in a different state to write his next book? But unbeknownst to him, a vampire, Kurt Barlow, and his human caretaker Richard Straker have moved into the old haunted Marston house, with the plans of eating the denizens of the village and creating a new brood of the undead. And the novel quickly becomes about Ben Mears, popular novelist turned vampire hunter, and his newfound group of friends. I believe that the original version of Alan Wake earlier in its development cycle was even more clearly based on Salem's Lot. The first trailer for the game that released in 2005 came with a text on the screen that reads, Alan Wake was a best-selling horror writer until he lost his muse and love. He comes to the small town of Bright Falls to recover and start anew. He writes a book inspired by his nightmares, but something goes horribly wrong. His nightmares start to come true. The second trailer does a similar thing where it says, I was a writer before my life fell apart. My name is Alan Wake. I came here to get help, to forget the past, and to sleep again. But alone with the darkness, the only thing worse than not sleeping is being awake. Based on this, I get the clear indication that Alice was originally already dead by the time the game starts, just like Ben Mears' wife. And that the initial pitch concept for the game was essentially, what if you combine the setting of Twin Peaks and the plot of Salem's Lot? But if they were taking from other works of art as liberally as they were, then I think more should have been taken from Salem's Lot in the final product to craft a better narrative here in the game. If you're going to steal from the best, then you should take the best that they have to offer. In Salem's Lot, we get to know the town well. Painfully well, some would say. We know the names of all of the influential people in town, as well as many of the non-influential people. We see those that society values and those that it has left behind. We know their wants, we know their fears. We even know the history of the land that the town sits upon. Salem's Lot is a long novel, and spends a great deal of its word count, making sure that we feel like we are sitting within its real, tangible space, watching things unfold before our very eyes. But in Alan Wake, the town of Bright Falls is largely a prop, an image that is merely alluded to rather than a place that exists. We get some of the history of the town, but not a lot. We see it in a few cutscenes, we get to explore the diner and sheriff's station, but never do we get to experience the town itself as it exists on a normal day. Never do we get to feel what Bright Falls is actually like, how it functions, and as a result, the scary version of the town doesn't feel quite as impactful as it really should. We feel no remorse for the downfall of the town, because we hold no emotional connections to it. Most of the gameplay doesn't even take place in the town proper, but instead in the wooded outskirts that lie on the periphery. I'm not the kind of guy that thinks that story structure is a definite concrete thing that should always be followed 100% of the time in every story that is ever told. That is a boring and desperately sad way to look at the world and at art. My own writing is very meandering and at times purposefully aimless. There are plenty of examples of great art, including Twin Peaks itself, that do not follow any traditional story structures at all. But I think some of those guidelines listed in structure are good to at least keep in the back of your mind, because they work for a reason. And even if you don't use them in a traditional way, they can still help you get out of problems in some instances. Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey is probably the most famous story structure behind the 3-act structure in writing. And the first step of that hero's journey is called The Ordinary World. in which we see the setting of our story as it is, before anything eventful ever happens, so that we get a feel for how this universe operates before anything weird happens to it, or in it. Haggard arriving at the shack on the rock and performing magic would not have the same impact if we did not see how the Dursleys lived in their normal house. The ring wraiths attacking the Shire would not have the same impact if we did not first have Bilbo's birthday party. But we don't get an ordinary world section in Alan Wake's narrative. The game starts off as we play through a 15-minute nightmare that functions as the tutorial, where Alan is visited by what seems to be the literal voice of God, who tells him that the town he is traveling to is cursed. One could argue that the diner section at the very beginning right after that serves as the game's ordinary world, but that lasts less than 5 minutes, and something weird and explicitly supernatural happens in the diner to Alan. So we don't actually see the world as it is. Alan essentially arrives into town, immediately has a supernatural experience with a force of pure evil in the first store that he walks into right after having a dream that warns him not to go to town, decides to stay anyways, and as a result his wife is taken by the evil, and he is involuntarily thrust into waging battle with the hordes of darkness on her behalf. It is almost biblical rather than resembling modern pop fiction. It would be like if when Ben Mears walks into the real estate agent's office at the beginning of Salem's Lot, and the agent said, "You don't want to move here because we're all going to die in the next week at the hands of an ancient vampire." And then he gives him definite proof that this is true and is absolutely going to happen. And then after being presented with that evidence, Mears responds that he's going to stick around anyway, without actually having any real motivation to do so other than the story demanding it. Out of all the story structures out there, the one that Alan Wake most conforms to would actually have to be the Dean Koontz structure, funny enough, which I don't really see as a favorable thing. His structure is as follows. 1. Plunge your main character into terrible trouble as soon as possible. 2. Everything he does to make things better makes them worse. 3. Make sure the last worst thing is insurmountable. 4. Then your hero succeeds by taking action, based on what he has learned about himself in the midst of all of these challenges. And I think there's some benefits from using this type of story. It certainly can be exciting, and is based entirely on ratcheting up tension as the story continues with one massive payoff, which can be an attractive goal within horror or any type of fiction. Dean Koontz has sold 500 million books for a reason. But the first step of plunging the character into terrible trouble as soon as possible really limits the scope of emotional possibilities that the story can have, because it allows for essentially zero setup for the narrative at large, in the goal of trying to get to the action as fast as humanly possible. The vampires do not make their first move in Salem's Lot until about a third of the way into the novel, when they kill their first victim, Danny Glick, and it isn't even really evident that we're dealing with vampires until much later. And I know this is a video game and is a very different medium, so I'm not advocating for the first third of Alan Wake to be him hanging out at the coffee shop chatting with locals. But imagine a version of this game that has a similar opening to BioShock Infinite, except done with a much more purposeful intent on learning about the people who live here. Say what you will about that game, but it at least understood the importance of making sure that the players felt the nuances of this society, and how this setting worked before they ever threw anything different at the player. The end section of that game, where the whole city is in ruins, only has the impact that it does because we've seen and interacted with a pristine version of it only hours earlier. Bright Falls is a town that is constantly in a state of both fully functioning and also destroyed, that we never get to learn about or spend much time in, making it feel like it's not its own real tactile place. Aside from this shot where we get to see the main street, I don't even really know what this town looks like in the daytime. It is an idea of a town locked inside of a snow globe, rather than a real place that I can conjure within my mind. When I think of Alan Wake, I think of the woods. Most of the game takes place in the woods, but I think the game developers really wanted you to think of Bright Falls, and feel attached to this setting, and stumbled hard when it came to delivering that. Throughout the game, there are multiple times where we see and hear advertisements for the upcoming Deerfest. They want you to know that this is a thing that the town will be celebrating soon, but this ends up being nothing more than flavor text. And I think it was a horrible decision to not actually include the festival in the game, preferably at the beginning before Alice goes missing. It could have been the primary reason that the couple decided to vacation in Bright Falls to begin with. It would have given a nice interactive way to explore the main street, and see several different attractions and shops, while also getting to know the people of this town better, while also being able to incorporate the tutorial in a way that is less heavy-handed than how it is presented in the game, where essentially God himself gives you a gun from a beam of light and commands you to kill from the heavens. It would have been a way to start several side narratives for the player to later choose to explore, because the whole town would have converged into one place together at the same time. This one moment would be the beginning of all branching paths that could later be explored, or not explored, based on the player's decisions. Control would not even have to be taken away from the player to do this. You could have it open-ended where the player could talk with whoever they wanted to or did not want to speak to. And it would have offered a fun way to include some mini-games that didn't naturally fit into the rest of the story. And also, most importantly, would have given us that emotional connection to this place before things go awry. Alice disappears 30 minutes into the game for most people, and the opening tutorial takes about 15 minutes. So that leaves the remaining 15 minutes for us to get to know Alan and Alice's relationship, learn why Alan is struggling to write, while also getting an emotional connection and feel for the town before things get spooky. And that simply is not enough time to do that. I'm not trying to be a dick here, but people always talk about Alan Wake having this totally deep and meaningful character-based narrative. But over the course of the entire game, if we add up all the time that characters are directly interacting with each other, it only comes to, by my count, roughly 89 minutes. A good deal of which is characters just yelling quippy lines at each other in combat. The rest of it is just us by ourselves shooting strangers in the woods. And this opening's general handling of Alice as a character in her brief few minutes of life is to me wildly misogynistic. The drive to find her and protect her is the central core motivation of the game. But we know absolutely nothing about her other than she's pretty, cares about you, and is afraid of the dark, needing your constant devotion and help to defend her and look after her. She is animated like a corpse. She's a non-entity who exists as a flesh sacrifice to give us entertainment. She basically looks into Alan's eyes and says, "I am the woman here to be vaporized to give you purpose." In the entire game, she hardly has a single line, and like half of them are her calling out the name Alan for help. And the rest of them are just extremely infantile in how she is characterized. I mean, just listen to some of these lines.
Cheer up, handsome. We're here.
Mission accomplished. The key and the directions.
My hero. I got some flashlights, just in case.
Also, right before she disappears, when she calls you upstairs, they make a point of you walking in on her dressed like this, which does imply an intimacy between the couple, but it is the only costume change in the entire game for any character. This is the only time that anyone has a different model is for this one moment, if you don't count Barry wrapping Christmas lights around his body. And the motivations there are to be suspect. The game is essentially a soft remake of Cherry 2000, depicting one man's trek through hell to fix his broken sex robot. I'm not really wanting to seem mean-spirited when I say this, but I really can't get my head around how Remedy as a company came to be, and how that conflicts with what they create. Their first video game as a small studio was 1996's Death Rally. And as a studio located in Finland, they did not feel comfortable with English enough to write the game's instructions in the language. And so one of the people who worked there hired their friend, Sam Lake, to come in and write them because he had studied English literature in college. While working on the game's instructions, Lake noticed that there was a lot of empty negative space in the menu screens, and asked if he could write additional text to fill that space that added some flavor information about these cars. They liked him, he did the job well, and as a result he became their lead narrative designer for their next title, Max Payne, and also famously provided the face for the titular character. For this job, he went back to school to study writing to make sure that he was up to the task. He continued to grow within the organization, eventually taking the role of creative director for the entire company, which is the position that he still holds to this day. And so I'm genuinely confused how a company that positions itself as being strongly driven by a study of narrative drops that ball consistently in essentially all of their titles, at least in my opinion. There are so many ideas that are introduced to the narrative of Alan Wake that go absolutely nowhere, to a point that it is pretty frustrating to try and keep up with it all. It is a never-ending series of setups, without a single real payoff. A big deal is made in Chapter 1, and the beginning of Chapter 2, that Alice has a tremendous fear of the dark, and cannot handle being by herself in it. After Chapter 2, this is never brought up again, and serves no purpose other than to make us feel bad that Alice is trapped in the dark presence, and is probably scared. A manipulation tactic to try and make us care about a character who's only in the game for about 8 minutes or so. But since we never see her again, all of that build-up and time is essentially for nothing. There's no payoff to her story. Dr. Hartman hires Ben Mott to try and pretend that he has kidnapped Alice so that Alan will give his manuscript to him so that Dr. Hartman can study it and learn more about Alan creatively, because he has an obsession. This subplot takes up an entire third of Alan Wake's story. Once the lodge that he lives and works in is attacked, we not only never see Hartman again and never learn what happens to him, but no character ever references him again. He might as well have not existed because he's so unimportant to the events presented here, despite taking up a tremendous amount of screen time. Hartman later appears again in 2019's Control, and he now looks like this, which is an amazing character design. But I've played that game and I can't tell you why the years have been so hard on him. A massive problem with both of these games is hiding so many details of its main story in its supplementary materials, similar to Metal Gear Solid 5. In Alan Wake, the story is told through manuscript pages that can be found in hidden areas of the levels. They are pages from a book that Alan has written about himself, but does not remember ever writing. But somehow the events of these pages are coming true. When you read them after collecting them, their purpose is to be a replacement for on-screen storytelling, and give you the plot context of why these things are important. I don't want to, nor should I have to, listen to an exorbitant amount of cassette tapes, read manuscript pages or government files, just to know the basic idea of what is happening on screen, and what is being presented at me without any context. It's an awful storytelling device if used in excess. It's supplementary in most games for a reason. In the most recent Resident Evils, for instance, there are plenty of files that you can pick up and read, but that only enhances the information you already know. It isn't required to even understand the basic ideas of the plot, and on top of that, there's only a handful of these to be found in each game, compared to the 84 cassette tapes in Metal Gear Solid 5, that total almost 7 hours of listening content, the 106 manuscript pages in Alan Wake, and the roughly 530 collectible secret government documents, interviews, and clips in Control. If a player has little to no idea what is going on in the story without diving into that homework, then I would strongly argue that you have failed in crafting a narrative, or at least an enjoyable one. And that isn't some anti-intellectual, I don't like reading kind of statement. I collect books. I own hundreds of books. It's about not embracing the fundamentals of your own chosen medium and art form. Alan Wake is a game that is held together with chewing gum and rubber bands. The same could be said for pretty much every game that has ever been published, but it is more so evident when playing this than just about anything I've ever experienced before. A tremendous amount of hard work ended up being wasted on something that ultimately was just a bit of a glorified tech demo. Knowing the story here of the production of this makes me legitimately sad for what we could have had here, because so many of their ideas going into this project were great. All of the elements were there for this to be a genuine classic, instead of the cult classic that it is, which, by its nature, implies that it is a bit imperfect, but is so through interesting means. Alan Wake was famously in varying stages of production for 7 years, something which is unfortunately quite common today for games, but at the time was pretty rare. Remedy didn't have a new game after 2003's Max Payne 2 until Wake's release in 2010. And in those years the game underwent massive changes due to different reasons, with a primary one being a lack of cohesive vision from the project at the top, both from the creative and business aspects of game development. Alan Wake began its earliest stages in 2003, the year after Grand Theft Auto Vice City and the year before San Andreas. This was an era that was defined by Grand Theft Auto's impact on the medium. More and more games went open world to emulate that series' success for better or worse. It was a real Pandora's box moment for game design, and like many other titles, Alan Wake started off basically as another style ripoff of Grand Theft Auto, with a large, free-roaming at-will map with missions located in different spread-out explorable areas that could be accessed on foot but would be more likely reached by vehicle. The first gameplay demos that were shown off in 2005 make this inspiration clear. even having a GTA-style minimap in the bottom left corner, and driving around locations to get to missions being a key part of the gameplay loop. Even before they had the base idea of the story, they thought they knew what kind of game they wanted to make, and the location of where this was supposed to take place. And so even without knowing exactly what they were making, they began constructing the world that it would take place in to get ahead of the ball. And the level of detail that they went for here is astonishing, really. The entire team flew out to the Pacific Northwest to do field research on how the landscape in the game should feel. In this process, they took over 40,000 photographs of natural life in the area. They used official NASA data to make sure that the stars in the night sky would be in the right place for where Bright Falls was intended to be. There was a fully functional day and night cycle that was created for the open world using complex, never-before-seen lighting effects. There would have been the daylight hours, where Alan could explore and learn about the mystery in the area around him in relaxed safety, and prepare for the inevitable fall of night, when he would again have to fight the forces of darkness. I have also read in the earliest versions of the game that during the day you could build and fortify defenses to make the nighttime pass easier. The lights on your defenses would have been powered by gasoline generators, and you would have had to have made sure that you had enough fuel to last through each evening. It was basically the concept of survival horror made open world like Evil Within 2 would eventually do, except on an even grander scale, mixed also with the downtime of the daylight to have some calmer vibes character-based gameplay. A balance between the light and the dark. It's a pretty genius idea, one that creates a lot of room for all kinds of interactions and gameplay, and is also complemented by the main story of Alan's fight against the darkness and his own depression. In order to achieve this, a new engine had to be created from scratch to be able to have such a complicated functioning world run as they imagined. On top of that, they felt that all off-the-shelf physics programs were not capable of what they needed for a world this realistic, so they had to design their own, something which would have been extremely complicated to do and taken a great deal of resources. They hired meteorologists to fully understand the dynamics of wind patterns for their weather engine, to create dynamic systems that could change naturally during the day and night cycle. There exists concept art where massive tornadoes could spawn in the open world, which does not happen in the final game. Compare this weather to the contemporary Grand Theft Auto 4, which at the time was seen as cutting edge, and you can see that Remedy had insane aspirations for a studio their size, working with the technology available at the time. Remedy at the peak of Alan Wake's development only had 55 employees, which is just nuts to attempt to pull something like this off with. At the time, Remedy was in a contractually bound partnership with Microsoft, and the company directed them to make Alan Wake as technologically impressive as possible for a PC-exclusive release, to try and add to the company-wide effort of getting people on board for the then-upcoming Windows Vista. Late into development, Microsoft changed their minds, and told the studio that Alan Wake would now be an Xbox 360 exclusive, a system that it wasn't even intended to be on in the first place. And the developers were now stuck with this project that was being designed for top-of-the-line PCs, now being forced to run on a much less powerful home console system. At the 2006 Microsoft Event Showcase, there was a dedicated section just about Alan Wake on the PC, before its shift to 360. And the developers say outright that the game is designed to be run on the most modern of PC systems, and that what they are trying to achieve is so sophisticated that it wouldn't have been possible to make this game even just a few years before this showcase. Specifically saying that no company has ever tried to incorporate lighting that is this complex in a large-scale game, like they were attempting. It is a similar situation that Cyberpunk underwent not all that long ago, in trying to push that as far as they could on PC, and then somehow trying to manage a home console release. Not only that, but as the years went by, Microsoft began to apply the thumbscrews a bit, out of a frustration that the project from the studio was taking a financially irresponsible amount of time to complete. Under the pressure of Microsoft and very late into development on the project, Lake said that the team entered what he described as an awful, unbearable heat and pressure period that the team half-jokingly referred to as the sauna, where over the course of only 2 months of extreme crunch, they scrapped the concept of Alan Wake being a free-roam game that they had spent years at that point developing, into being the linear short experience of 6 levels that exists today. He said a small team of people were assembled to look at what they had completed or near completed, and were designated to make the painful decisions of cutting extensively, and locking down anything that worked and was polished enough to be a part of the final product. I have read a few things that suggest that it may have been this late in the process that the decision was made to have Alan's flashlight be such a primary focus of the combat, because they had put so many resources into developing this lighting system for the day and night cycle, which at this point had been entirely removed from the game, and that they were desperate to incorporate that in some fashion. And I'm inclined to believe this, because going back and watching all of the trailers and demos, it isn't until just before launch that they show off the mechanic of Alan's flashlight being used to damage enemies, which is fairly odd considering that it's the primary foundation of the game's combat. Also, this trailer from the summer of 2009 just implies a very different story existed in the game at that point, with the character of Rusty fulfilling an entirely different, seemingly more important role. Whereas in the finished game, he is more or less written entirely out of the story. Other scenes that can be found in pre-release materials include Alan doing a book signing at the local bookstore, Alan giving a car ride to someone who is not in the final game, Alan fighting something in daylight hours, and a new section where Alan gets the keys to the cabin from Ben Mott at this gas station, which is probably intended to be a reference to Big Ed's gas station in Twin Peaks, instead of getting the keys from the diner like in the final game. At one point, the idea was floated that to salvage the open world and to get this to work on the hardware on short notice, they could put a volcano in the center of the map where the lake is now, that would be on the verge of erupting, which as a result, the townspeople of Bright Falls would have been evacuated, and Alan would be breaking evacuation orders and exploring on his own trying to survive in this environment, with just himself and the bad guys, similar to how Arkham City and Arkham Knight operate. This would have acted as an explanation as to why there were no NPCs, and would hopefully mask the cut content of the now scaled down story from when it was a massive GTA-style game. I've seen one estimate that the world created for this was 100 square kilometers, almost none of which has ever been publicly seen. There also were a great deal of different types of enemies in the game that could use different powers of darkness. All of this would be scrapped in the final game, in exchange for endless waves of a single type of enemy, lumberjacks who all do the exact same thing. Probably because they were the only enemy type that was functioning well enough to ship the game with on a short notice. This is also why Alan hops around a lot to different locations, even in instances where that may not make a ton of sense, because they were trying to incorporate as many of the best locations that had been built for the open world as possible, now being carved out to be used for linear levels, writing the new story around trying to fit in these places, rather than these locations existing for actual story purposes. This became the ethos of the entire last stage of the process. Take what is working, build the story to incorporate as many of those elements as possible, even if it doesn't make a ton of sense, and cut everything else. The only benefit to this is that the game's locations always have incredible looking vistas and backgrounds, especially compared to other games of its era, because it isn't faked like it usually was on other titles, and was at one point as well detailed and explorable as everything else in the level. Microsoft also made the bizarre decision to release Alan Wake the same week as Red Dead Redemption, and as a result, the game sold extremely poorly, and was at the time deemed a financial disaster, only selling 145,000 units in the first 2 weeks on the market. It would take over 3 years for the game to sell enough copies just to recoup the cost of production. But due to positive word of mouth, over the next decade it would eventually sell 3 million copies, and that figure is taken before the recent remaster, which sold for $30 on all modern systems, including the Switch. Lake has said that in those last few months of the process, what became the story that Alan Wake formed into was intended to be a bit of a metaphor of them working on this project so long in the dark, without really knowing what it was. That the struggle of making Alan Wake became the base story of Alan Wake, of a successful author or game studio, who over the course of years can't seem to bring himself, or themselves, to deliver his or their next project, partially out of a fear of not living up to his or their previous successes, and in a way, being haunted by that. It became a dual, almost meta story about the creative process. And so, with all of this in mind, it is here that we should start to examine Alan Wake as presented in the final product that eventually shipped. Instead of talking about what Alan Wake isn't, here we will talk about what Alan Wake is. Chapter 1. As I said before, we start off with a tutorial where we are led by an entity that seems to be God to a lighthouse. Then Alan wakes up on the ferry into Bright Falls, gets his key from the diner, they arrive at the cabin, and Alice goes missing. Alan then wakes up next to his wrecked car in the woods 1 week later, not knowing how he got there. That's all done within the first half hour. And from the very beginning, there is a clear lack of polish on certain details. Alan gets into the driver's seat of the car. Then 5 seconds later in the next shot, he and Alice have switched places. Stuff like that. In his wrecked car, Alan finds a copy of a book written by a doctor named Emil Hartman, who will end up being a major character in the plot as the story unfolds, as he is the town psychiatrist of Bright Falls who is slowly going mad. I also really hate this kind of writing. My biggest complaint with so many works of fiction is that it so often feels as if either people stop existing when they are not around the main character, or that everyone in the story knows each other and has a personal connection and history, often with everyone being related. Even in tales that take place across entire continents or galaxies, it makes worlds feel small. And I think textual information should be used to develop and infer that these people are part of their own stories, and interests that are messy and independent of what is happening to the main character, rather than forcing ultimately meaningless connections between the entire cast for unneeded drama that all revolve around the same boring man. Now, it is later revealed that Alice and Hartman know each other, and he is the reason that they have vacationed here, because Alice thinks that Hartman can help Alan based on his focus on creativity. But I think ultimately this is something that should be avoided in writing, because it often does less for a story than what it adds. Because their connection is essentially meaningless. His role in the game is meaningless. A holdover from an earlier iteration where Alice was already gone, and Alan had to come to Bright Falls to receive help. Just after finding this and watching his car topple over the side of a cliff, Alan is chased through the woods by the possessed body of local citizen Carl Stuckey, who Alan actually rented the cabin from. This connection is also meaningless. Alan hides from him in a shed and finds a few weapons there to defend himself. I do think it's very funny how open and willing Alan is to the concept of murdering strangers. He finds a flashlight and a gun, then right outside Alan is approached by two men that he doesn't know and he just starts blasting.
I'd never fired a gun outside a shooting range, and now I just killed someone.
Also, he somehow knows that he needs to use his flashlight on them to rid them of the darkness before he kills them, which he just pulls from the ether in a dream that he had, that functioned as the tutorial. We the player know this because we have seen the trailers and know the base concept of the game, but at no point does the character actually have that aha moment of discovering that light hurts these creatures. He just knows. He just accepts that this dream really must have been a vision from God, and at no point questions this. And that is a real shame, because we could have had a really scary sequence where Alan is trying to hurt these things and nothing is causing any damage, and all he can do is run and hide, similar to Mr. X and Resident Evil 2. And then when he does figure it out, he can turn the tables on them for a really impactful feeling moment, but nothing like that is done. I understand this is a thing with the limitations of the medium, of telling a story within a game that has to, by its nature, have some sort of compelling gameplay. But as we said, that problem of trying to present a narrative while also making something fun is so on display here. It makes no sense that by the end of this chapter, a couple dozen townsfolk go missing overnight, and they arrest a guy who is new to town, who has on his person a shotgun, a handgun, a flare gun, who is also, by the way, arrested in the gas station owned by one of the people who have disappeared. But they only treat him as a suspect in an ongoing investigation. Here, Alan Wake demonstrates the worst aspects of big-budget video games as a medium. Alan just happens to find multiple pistols, flares, flashlights, rifles, and shotguns, littered around the forest floor for him to dispense of these people with. There's a shotgun in a gazebo in the middle of the woods. It makes no sense. At least in other games, the chosen setting generally excuses why there may be guns all over the place. BioShock Infinite takes place in a world on the brink of an armed revolution. Same for The Last of Us, mixed with its apocalypse survival theme. Red Dead takes place in a time known for its guns. In these different fictional worlds, they have some sort of built-in reason for why there would be guns lying all over the place. But here in an aggressively normal town in the modern Pacific Northwest, it just doesn't work. And I get that I live in a country that literally has more guns than people. But I just think that if they had just worked on this a little more, it could have felt better implemented somehow. There's gotta be a better solution. They really nailed the mystic gun in Control, and I think they could have gone for something similar here that worked a lot better. Over the course of the game, you kill so many enemies, And these are real people who are citizens of the town, who Alan is inferred to really be killing. They're just possessed like the Deadites of Evil Dead. We see Carl Stuckey in the daylight as just a normal dude, but at night he becomes infected with the darkness and goes mad, and Alan kills him with a lot of his friends. I assume all of these people who do not get killed go back to normal with the dawn. We are never shown that or given much information on this process. But there was a sign in the open world that can't be found in the main game that reads Bright Falls population 2086. A single missing persons case in a town that small would be a big deal, let alone dozens. The only rationalization I can make for this is that not all of these enemies are intended to be people from Bright Falls. They are dressed as the woodsmen from Twin Peaks, which were interdimensional beings of pure darkness that have made their way into our world and taken that form. And so a good deal of them may have been this universe's Black Lodge spirits. But honestly, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I really do not know who we're fighting through most of this game, which is a massive problem if the game is focused on fighting. They are essentially the exact same as the Hiss from Control, which I also didn't have an amazing grasp on why those people were the way that they were either. I didn't think they really wanted you to dwell on it that much, which is confusing to me, because there really isn't an in-universe answer that makes any of this make sense out of Alan just being crazy and all of this being in his head. We all know that in reality these types of things are all symptoms of a diseased production cycle, but they could have at least explained it away somehow within the world with just a few lines of dialogue between characters. So many problems could have been fixed with just a few lines. But it's a video game, and in a video game you need people to kill, so I guess here you go kinda deal. And I know that he's in a survival situation, but Alan describes himself as a pacifist on a few occasions, and he's actually a pretty aggressive guy, which is good character writing. Often having a character see themselves in one light that is totally off base from reality is pretty interesting. But there's not a single person in this game that I enjoy being around. And I'm certainly not someone who believes this is always a fault. There similarly isn't a likable character in the entire cast of Secession. But those people really know how to write, and are using that to build commentary on a lot of things going on in our world. Alan, however, is just not fun to inhabit. And when playing this, I kind of actively root for bad things to happen to him. He's a toxic guy, loaded with money, famous, great life, but still miserable. There's so much room to do compelling writing with a character like that. They work so much to create so many setups, but are never interested in exploring the ramifications of that or the payoffs, or even concluding ideas to themes that they present. Anyways, Alan fights his way through the woods and arrives at a gas station where he calls for help. The sheriff arrives, sees the injury that he has on his head from the car crash, and tells him that he needs immediate medical attention. She also informs him that the island where he rented his cabin does not exist, to which he doesn't believe her. The chapter ends with Alan standing by the lake, unable to process this information, of how this could be possible. For the footage collected to edit this video, I am playing on easy, and also have played Alan Wake a few times before, so I know generally what I'm supposed to be doing in most of these situations. So my time is not fully representative of what the average first-time player will experience. But at the end of each chapter, I'm going to say the total daylight hours and nighttime hours, so you get the idea of how uneven the balance of day gameplay is to night. I know the night is where all the combat is, but this game could have been so much more if the team had embraced its more banal and relaxed elements. One of the most enjoyable things about Twin Peaks is how relaxing it is, but they are not interested in exploring that nature of life that conflicts with the total horrors that coexist with it. All of that got cut in favor of what we have here. For this chapter, final daylight time is 12 minutes, and nighttime, 39 minutes. Total citizens of Bright Falls killed, 22. Chapter 2. Alan wakes up in the sheriff's station that is a complete recreation of the one from Twin Peaks, being inspected by a doctor who looks and acts just like Doc Haywood from Peaks, who also happens to have a main character trait of enjoying fishing. He then meets Grant, the secretary, who's just a stand-in for Lucy from Twin Peaks. They're both sweet, but kind of off and ditzy, and talk with the exact same type of distinctive voice. Like, it just feels like the voice direction team told this voice actor to literally just do an impression of Kimmy Robertson's Lucy.
She heard what she thinks could be a prowler outside her house.
Of course, Mr. Wake. You can get there through the cell corridor. Just don't mind Walter in there. He's one of our regulars.
She tells Alan to go meet with the sheriff, who is actually a fairly original character, even though she's terrible at her job. She asks like 3 questions to Wake before giving him back his belongings, minus the guns that he just used to kill a crowd of possessed townsfolk. In any other medium outside of AAA games, the only outcome of this would be Alan being held in federal prison as a domestic terrorist. As soon as he gets his things back, his phone immediately rings because of course it does. And on the line is a man who claims to have kidnapped Alice, and that he wants to meet Alan in the woods tonight after dark, with no police. Alan tells the sheriff that he has to leave because he has to do something important, but he cannot explain what it is. She at this point has no reason to trust him whatsoever, other than the fact that he is a rich, famous white man. Then in the middle of this conversation, he punches out the first person that he sees, and she's just totally cool with him walking out of her station a free man. This is a world that plays by no concrete rules and has absolutely no stakes. That is all the daytime that we get for this chapter, so if you were hoping that we would have time to explore this cute town, oh well. After a brief sequence where Alan's literary agent Barry picks him up and takes him to their rented cabin, we are immediately thrust back into the same repetitive explore the woods and kill shadow people routine. I don't want to seem like I'm being petty and getting bogged down in small details, but this game is made up on a micro level out of some shoddy things that are constantly really distracting, which is a real shame when so much of the detail work genuinely is great on a surface level. But when you take the time to attempt to really immerse yourself in this world, it all falls apart like sand in your hands. And just in general, this didn't get the polish that it needed. Like here, where Alan throws down this lamp in a fit of rage and it makes roughly the same sound that a pillow would.
Damn it, Barry, they'll kill her!
Moments later, when you step out of the cabin, you find this cool looking old well, but when you look down it, a hole was never built with the model, so it's just grass. The next building you come across has an oddly placed coffee maker on the desk. But there's not a sink in the entire place. No source of water. It's just an empty, meaningless Twin Peaks prop that is sitting here with the hopes that you won't actually notice or think about it too much. But when trying to build a world, this is super sloppy. It doesn't even have a wire. None of the coffee machines in this game are plugged into anything. Where do these people go to the bathroom? Or get the water to use this coffee pot? The area outside is explorable and there isn't a public toilet, sink, spigot, or even porta potty anywhere near here. There isn't anything that could actually be used to survive if people were to actually rent these vacation cabins. And this might seem petty, I understand, but it's just one example of how almost every detail of this world doesn't work under any level of scrutiny because of the quick process that it was all thrown together at the end of its development. The biggest appeal of video games is that you get to inhabit a fictional space. Games can do visual environmental storytelling better than anything else. And on that front, the smallest of details matter. What they're doing here are just coded visual symbols that they're throwing at you, and hoping that you just move on quickly. Which is fine for certain fast-paced games like, say, Ghost Runner. But they don't want you to actually look and appreciate these things. You aren't supposed to take them in, which is a bit contradictory to the aspirations of creating a photorealistic world that you can explore. Soon after this, on the way to Lover's Peak, which is probably only called that because they got to use the word peak, you find a sign that you can read talking about the history of the area's Douglas firs, which is only here because Dale Cooper likes Douglas firs. Soon after that, you find a page from Alan's book that starts with the sentence, "Agent Nightingale didn't want to be in Bright Falls. These little communities revolted him, and he didn't like the trees or the coffee." Which, if you replace the word Nightingale with Rosenfeld, it would be a descriptor of that character. Because they are the same, because everything presented here is derivative to a near criminal degree. Anyways, we meet up with the kidnapper. He doesn't have Alice, and the chapter ends with a pretty fun combat situation, where he doesn't trust you with guns, so you can only use flares while he uses guns to take them out. I'm unclear why he and a select few others in town are not affected by the dark presence at night, because it feels like basically the whole town turns into zombies except for like 5 people that randomly don't, and it is never really well explained what makes them so special. Alan gets his guns again, gets in a stolen truck, drives back to the cabin that he's staying in with his agent Barry where the chapter started, and we're back full circle, with Alan learning nothing new about the mystery that surrounds him or himself. What would for most players be a full-on 2-hour or so section of gameplay, representative of 1/6 of this experience, could be for the most part entirely cut out, and nobody would notice the difference. For this chapter, final daylight time is 17 minutes, nighttime is 54 minutes. Total citizens of Bright Falls killed, 73. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is for most players probably the longest in the game, featuring enough content to really be 2 entire chapters worth. But from a story perspective, pretty much everything that can be said about Chapter 2 can also be said about Chapter 3. Nothing happens here. You can play Chapter 1, then you can go straight to Chapter 4 and not feel like you've missed a whole lot. We start off with Alan and Barry going to investigate a weird phone call that they got at the end of the last chapter, and are not put off at all by the fact that this person, who was very cheerful the first time that they met her, is now acting like a zombie because she's possessed by the dark presence. They don't even really ask her if she's feeling okay, or seem personally put off by how she's acting. Look at this before and after.
Welcome to the Oh Dear Diner.
Hi, I was wondering if you could help me. I'm looking for...
Mr. Wake, Alan Wake. Oh God, I am your biggest fan. I know people say that all the time, but I really am.
I'm glad to hear that.
Barry, you found him.
Hi, Rose.
Oh wow, I was just thinking about you too.
Great.
I was just bringing Rusty some coffee. He's on the balcony, looking after Max. Mr. Wake, I'm so glad you're here.
Rose, you have my manuscript?
Oh yes. Yes. Please, come in.
They come in and accept a cup of coffee and are immediately poisoned, and that's all the daytime you get. Alan wakes up hours later after night has fallen, and doesn't even check to see if his best friend is still alive, after finding him face down on a table, before running outside to kill more denizens of this sleepy town. The police, along with the FBI, have decided that it was probably a bad idea to let Alan go after his wife disappeared, along with about 1/10 of the population of Bright Falls, all around the same time that he came to town. So the first section of this is the most boring manhunt that you'll find in a game. You just run in a straight line for 8 minutes, while you hear sirens behind you and flashlights, shouting, helicopters, and occasional gunfire. But none of this matters. You can just stop walking altogether and they'll never catch up to you. This is the introduction to one of the primary antagonists of the game, FBI Special Agent Nightingale, who only gets roughly 1.5 minutes of screen time. If you don't read the optional manuscript pages that you can collect along the way, then you have no context who this person is and why you should care. Just the very basics of writing being completely mishandled. Also, The Nightingale is the song that Julie Cruz is singing in the bar in the first episode of Twin Peaks. It's just Twin Peaks all the way down. This chapter is really where you can feel that this started as an open world game. There are 3 distinct locations that Alan has to get to. Starting at the trailer park, he has to make it to the radio station, then the train depot, and finally the silver mine that leads to a mountain overlook. And all of these locations are really far apart, so a great deal of this chapter is just running through the empty woods. And it is gorgeous. Every location in this game is stunning from an art direction standpoint. But the same could be said about Metal Gear Solid 5, and that doesn't mean I like running through empty deserts for 10+ minutes at a time. We have a large section of the open world available to us here for pretty much the only time in the game. But since all of the open world things have been removed except for the mission objectives, it just feels vast and empty. In one of these walks, Alan gets a phone call from Alice, who sounds distant and afraid, essentially confirming that she is trapped in this game's version of the Twin Peaks Black Lodge, saying that she's in a dark location and is scared, and that there's a man there who looks just like Alan, but is mean. Just like Mr. C, Dale Cooper's doppelganger in Twin Peaks. Also, can you imagine if Lynch and Frost had let characters use cell phones to get in contact with people in Twin Peaks from the Red Room? Like I said, Walmart brand Lynch. Alan gets to the radio station. Then not even 1 minute goes by before the police swarm the building and he narrowly escapes to a train depot nearby. This is actually a pretty unique stretch of gameplay. Alan doesn't have his guns at the beginning of the chapter. He actually frustratingly loses them at the beginning of every single chapter, only to find new ones in the woods each night. So if you're ever saving any ammunition for later, you might as well just use it. I think this is a result from at one point late in development, the idea was tossed around that to buy them some time to make this better, they could release it a chapter at a time as downloadable content, like the Half-Life 2 chapters. But it was agreed upon that the Xbox marketplace wasn't at a point of popularity that could yet sustain a project like that with the budget that they were working with. And once that idea got scrapped and they decided to put it all on one disc and release it all at once, I suspect they didn't change much about the episodic format, leaving the game to feel really weird in some areas like this. As soon as you finish a chapter, it cuts immediately to previously on Alan Wake, and gives you a recap of what you just did for the past hour. It's very strange. But here, since he no longer has his guns, he has to resort to only using flashbangs that he finds in the police cars after they get overtaken by the forces of darkness. And you don't have any other option than to just take a few steps back, let a bunch of guys close in on you, then use the grenade to take them all out at once, which is a fun twist on the gameplay that is very satisfying. Also, a new enemy type is introduced here, which are objects possessed by the Dark Presence that are flung at you very quickly unless you use your flashlight to stop them. This was actually done completely by accident. When they were working on developing the game, they kept having this weird bug where the physics engine that they built would sometimes on random objects cause them to shake violently and occasionally fly away, hitting Alan. They thought it looked cool and decided to modify it and keep it. This kind of thing is great. So often when creating, you show up to work and expect something to go one way, and then are totally taken off guard by a new thing you discover along your journey. Part of the creative process is being open to little revelations like that. So I love that they took this bug and instead of trying to figure out how to fix it, they just embraced it and made it a common enemy type. A great example of work smarter, not harder. Alan steals a car from the station because he has to make it to the coal mine to meet the kidnapper, who supposedly has Alice. There's a fun idea for a boss fight here, where you have to use the car's headlights to take out a swarm of enemies, including a few of the new possessed object types. I really feel like this fight and more variations like this were needed, because just shooting the same guys over and over again gets tiring very quickly. This is also one of the only instances in the game where the player is given actual choice, because if you wanted, you could get out of the vehicle and fight them on foot as well. Which, small things like this should have been the norm and not the exception. We then cut to the next morning, when Alan is going to meet the kidnapper. This is exciting, because we finally get to have some non-guided time in the daylight hours to explore this world. The other times it has been frustratingly on rails with NPCs following you and telling you what to do. But on the road there's only a few empty buildings. Then we arrive at the meeting, the kidnapper doesn't show up, and Alan takes a nap and suddenly it's nighttime again, and he has to go out and kill more people in the woods. He finally finds the kidnapper at a different mountain called Mirror Peak, which is called that so that they can use that word peak again, who is immediately taken by the darkness, and Alan is thrust over the edge of a cliff and lands in the lake. Another chapter where no new elements are added to the mystery and nothing is learned, not a single clue. Just spinning its wheels while you shoot lumberjacks over and over and over again. For this chapter, final daylight time is 9 minutes. Nighttime, 76 minutes. Total citizens of Bright Falls killed, 114. Chapter 4. Alan wakes up in the Great Northern Lodge. Alan wakes up in the Cauldron Lake Lodge, which is totally different from the building that looks the exact same in Twin Peaks. He's being held captive by Dr. Hartman, the town psychiatrist that we mentioned earlier. He attempts to gaslight Alan, saying that everything that has happened so far was not real, and that he imagined the whole thing. To which Alan says, "Wait, that's not true." And Hartman immediately gives up and says, "Fine, you got me." It is extremely comical how short-lived Hartman's attempt to control Wake is, despite the effort that he has put into this ruse. He hired the kidnapper, and essentially has been behind all of the struggle for Chapter 2 and 3, just so that he can get Wake into his custody and into his facility to study him. None of these concepts come across as well written because they are given no time for needed development. Anything that takes more than 5 minutes has got to go, because we've got to get back to killing more mystery logmen. The psychiatric facility is located in an old stone and log hotel that has been rendered beautifully. It's one of the best looking locations in the game, although the animations on the patients are inhumane, and one crawls over the couch in the lobby just like Bob did in Twin Peaks, because of course he does. Also, he just keeps saying the word scary repeatedly, because that's probably just the first thing that they thought for him to say.
Trophies when you first arrived here. I do love to hunt. The great outdoors.
The hotel closed some years ago and remained empty until it was converted into a local psychiatric facility, used only to house mentally unwell artists, which are the type of patients that Dr. Hartman specializes in. Financially, this doesn't make a bit of sense. The game presents this to you like it is a totally normal idea and one that you should absolutely accept, and not just the stupidest concept that a story could throw at you. I mean, we're talking about a property that would be valued in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, to house a private practice of what seems like 10 patients. There's a very similar mountain retreat hotel located just a few minutes from where I live called the Grove Park Inn, that sold in 2012 for $120 million. I just can't get over it. Is Dr. Hartman a Bond villain or something? Is this his billionaire hobby? Despite how silly it is, this is probably the best chapter in the game, or at least the one that contains the most memorable moments that people usually talk about. As soon as you leave the facility, Alan has to make his way through the hedge maze from The Shining, which makes, I think, the 5th direct reference to that movie by this point. You then run through the woods for the next 30 minutes or so until you get to the main set piece of the game. In the town of Bright Falls, there is an old retired metal band who used to be called the Old Gods of Asgard. One of them wears an eye patch, probably because Nadine also wore one in Twin Peaks. Barry and Alan lead the minions of the Dark Presence through the woods to their old rock stage, to use their leftover fireworks and concert stage lights to kill them in waves. It's a great fight, and has a lot of fun lighting going on in it. I know I've already said this, but this is the kind of thing that should be happening all the time in this game. If the core concept is going to be based around unique uses of light, then that's what the game should primarily deliver on. This section is talked about so much online because it is one of the only ones that actually lives up to the premise of the game. For instance, this whole chapter it is storming outside, and it could be fun if every time the lightning flashed, the enemies around you took damage. But nothing like that ever goes on here. Wouldn't it be funny or clever to have a stealth section, but you have to stay in the light as much as possible instead of the dark like in most games? After the fight, there's another needless 30-minute stretch through some farmland, and once reaching safety, Alan and Barry get blackout drunk to celebrate. And in his stupor, Alan remembers everything that has been missing from his memory in the past week. Basically, from what I can understand, for an unexplained reason, the lake and the Dark Presence feeds on art, and also has the ability to take art and manifest it into reality, which is the explained reason that there's enough insane local artists to have their own facility, and that for the week that he blacked out, Alan was living in the cabin with the Dark Presence in her human form, while she was forcing him to write a novel for her, the contents of which are the manuscript pages that you keep finding as collectibles in the game that are coming true as you play. When it's in its woman form, it is taking the physical identity of a local Bright Falls woman named Barbara Jagger, who was in love with a similar visiting author in the 1970s, who was also found dead when she drowned in the lake. The author, Thomas Zane, is the voice of God that Alan hears, and went through his own similar experience with the Dark Presence back in the 70s, and I think has been trapped in the lake ever since, which is why he wears an old diver's suit when he physically appears. Although he reappears in Control and says that that was only a costume that he likes to wear, so who knows. I've played this game multiple times and I honestly don't know what's going on there well. It's like the main motivation of what's happening in the story, but a grand total of about 4 minutes and the entire game is spent on it. It is so poorly explained that it honestly isn't worth the time of trying to figure it out. Some could say that that in itself is purposefully similar to Twin Peaks, but I would say those people are wrong. Lynch operates on internal and consistent logic that actually is trying to communicate specific ideas, emotions, and themes with the audience. Pretty much everything in Twin Peaks does make sense either on an emotional or logical level if you sit with it. Twin Peaks The Return Episode 8 almost doesn't have a single line of dialogue. It is just extremely intense imagery for an hour straight, but is using consistent visual communicators that have been throughout the entire series, so it is always clear what is going on here, and is extremely effective in serving the explanation for just about everything in the series. This is not Lynch. He presents emotions, characters, themes. This is merely a collection of hazy mimicries. It's a poor man's doppelganger to what was going on in that show. I've been sitting on Alan Wake for a decade and I have no clue what this game is actually trying to tell me. For this chapter, final daylight time is 17 minutes, nighttime 54 minutes. Total citizens of Bright Falls killed, 73. Chapter 5. It's finally the day of Deerfest. We get a cinematic of the town gathering for the festival that lasts for genuinely 20 seconds. And then we cut to later that night so Alan can go kill more shadow people. Him and Barry have been apprehended by the police with the assistance of Nightingale, who mentally snaps when the police want to let him go, and pulls out his pistol to execute Alan on the spot right there in the sheriff's station, only for the doors to blow open and the darkness to suck him away, never to be seen again. Which honestly seems like a bad move on the Dark Presence's part, because if its goal is to kill Alan, it seems really dumb to kill the guy with the gun to his head. If the Dark Presence doesn't want Alan dead, why send so many spooky lumberjacks after him? Like, why should we even care at this point? Also, right before his death, he realizes what's going on in the scene, and frantically pulls out a page of Alan's manuscript that his death scene is written on, knowing in horror that what he has read has been manifested into reality, implying that he has found several of these pages out in the wild, and to a degree knows the future, and has accidentally brought about his own doom in this self-fulfilling prophecy. Which is a super fascinating idea that could have been explored further if the character was on screen for more than 2 minutes and 10 seconds. He's supposed to be one of the main bad guys and is just a total non-entity. Sheriff Breaker gives Barry a list of names that he has to call to let them know that the town is in danger and that they need their help. One of which is her father, the old sheriff. Another is the radio announcer that you've been listening to while playing the whole game. To this, Barry replies, "What is this, some kind of secret society? These men never come to the rescue. You never see these men. This has nothing to do with anything. It is only here because Twin Peaks has a secret society called the Bookhouse Boys, of prominent men in town who are there to protect in times of need." These writers really can't help themselves, it's some sort of bizarre compulsion. The next half hour is the only time that we ever actually get to spend in the town of Bright Falls. The sheriff now believes that Alan is being personally hunted by the possessed, deadite-like townspeople, and she just whips out her shotgun to help blast locals away, and get Alan to the local hospital so that they can steal its helicopter, because Alan had a vision that he has to get to the local dam because that is where the lamp lady lives, and she needs his help. This section is really frustrating, because your objective reads, "Follow Sarah." She sets the pace for this. But there's quite a few times where her character AI gets confused and she just strolls around aimlessly, like she's waiting for you to do something even though you cannot move forward without her taking action. The tragic thing about this is that they have so many things in this section modeled for the Deerfest. What is used as set dressing here in a more mature or better managed game could have been something really worthwhile. Sorry to keep bringing it up, it's just that the Deerfest really to me is symbolic of everything that went wrong here. Something that could be used to build real character is relegated to being a background prop for Alan to shoot lumberjacks in front of for unclear reasons. After you get off the helicopter, you have another encounter at the base of the dam with some more taken. But for some reason, the game arbitrarily decided that Alan left all of his equipment in the helicopter. All you have now is your flashlight and pistol. I really hate this, and it happens all the time in this game. At this point, I had saved up multiple flashbangs, flares, flare gun ammo, and shotgun shells for harder fights later on in the level. What is the purpose of giving your player rare, limited resources that are hard to come by, that incentivizes them to save those items for special moments, if you're just going to take them away whenever you feel like it? Genuinely baffling game design. For what reason would Alan leave those things behind in the helicopter when he got off of it? Why would he do that? Anyways, we find Cynthia Weaver, the lamp lady, and she gives some more nonsense exposition. It is here where we get the funniest revelation in the game, where we learn that all the guns that have been left in the woods for Alan to find that value probably upwards of about $100,000 were purchased and put there by the 64-year-old lamp lady in her free time. It would be like in the famous Twin Peaks equivalent scene when Hawk, Doc Hayward, Truman, and Cooper arrive at the log lady's cabin. She just opens up a storage locker of military-grade supplies and tell them to load up because they've got to blast away the man from another place. It's the only way that he can be dealt with, and he's got to be stopped. She gives him a mission to find a place called the Well-Lit Room, because there he will find what he's looking for, which he abandons because he sees the helicopter that Barry and Sheriff Breaker are in getting attacked and goes off in search to help them. Which, I don't really know why he cares so much, considering that a few days before this he found his seemingly lifeless body on a coffee table after drinking poison and just shrugs it off. Anyways, Alan saves his friends, kills more shadow people, then reunites with the lamp lady in the well-lit room at the end of the chapter, where he finds two objects that hold the secret that has been evading him this whole time. The first is a light switch clicker that he once gave to Alice as a romantic gesture, that light could always be found nearby if she was scared of the dark. This is something that doesn't make sense, because it is left over from when the game was a different game. In the open world, it would have been a strong object of power like those found in Control, that Alan could click to switch the game's day and night cycle immediately. It would have had a very limited number of charges, but he could switch it from nighttime to daytime or vice versa each time one of those charges were used. Here it is just a confusing remnant that is a failed attempt at repurposing this idea into something usable that just comes across as gibberish. It's actually a similar plot device to the rubber glove from Twin Peaks Season 3, which I also really hate, which similarly was a holdover from the original Season 3 back in the 90s. The other object found here is a page from a different manuscript that Alan did not write, but one that describes an event from Alan's childhood, and he realizes in horror that this whole time he and everyone that he knows have simply been the characters in a different novel written by Thomas Zane in the 1970s. We are all like the dreamer who dreams, and then lives inside the dream, but who is the dreamer? You know, just like Twin Peaks. For this chapter, final daylight time is 20 seconds, nighttime 71 minutes. Total citizens of Bright Falls killed, 123. Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is easily the most well executed of the entire game, and I don't have a lot of criticisms about it from the perspective of simply judging how fun it is. They knew they at least had to nail their bombastic ending, and they did just that, at least from a gameplay perspective. We start with probably the weirdest section of the game, where we flash back to New York right after Alan's success with his previous book. Alan wakes up and is extremely hungover, and after taking some pills and putting on his sunglasses, he goes into the living room to watch his late-night interview filmed the previous day on the television. This is kind of boring and poorly done, and it just feels very off, as it is done in live action for some reason, with the actor who did the motion capture for Alan, but it has to be dubbed because Alan has a separate voice actor, leaving the program to feel otherworldly and nightmarish in ways that I'm not sure was entirely intended.
You selfish bastard, always thinking of yourself. Well, you've certainly given us a lot of entertainment over the years. And now that you mention it, Casey was a gloomy guy, never had much luck with his love life with the ladies. Was that autobiographical in any way?
Yeah, no kidding. Casey's lady friends tended to die on him. With Casey, it was all about his pain. No, nothing autobiographical about that. I'm a happily married man. My wife is my muse.
Well,
Alice then gets home and gives us an ass shot, before getting mad at how hungover he is, and the couple hugs as he promises to do better. Sam Lake has said the following about this scene's purpose in the game, which is a little weird to me, considering how little Alice actually has to do with it.
We want to make kind of characters that are more than that, just kind of cardboard cutouts or caricatures. We wanted to give them depth, and since Alice doesn't have that much screen time, it's a difficult thing. We wanted to make a strong female lead, and in some ways we saw that out of the couple, she is the stronger one. That's the reason why the New York flashbacks came into the game. We needed to show their relationship and show everyone that she is worth saving.
If you were to sit someone down and told them to watch this scene, and then afterwards you asked them what it was about, they would probably say that it was more about Alan than her. Like everything, she is an afterthought in his life. Alan's love is his career and his fame, and she is merely the human vessel that holds that idea for him and entertains him. An idea clearly on display but never actually dramatically examined within their relationship. I don't mean to harp on this, but Twin Peaks' whole deal is how important this woman's life was. She was taken from the world in a brutal way, and things were never the same again. It is an empathetic study about how much she meant as a person. Alice is this game's version of Laura Palmer, and she's just a series of ass shots and baby talk, which is probably the most damning misunderstanding of their primary inspiration. I do think that it is an extremely strange decision to have the longest scene in the game basically be us watching Alan watch himself on television. This sequence goes on for 7 minutes. and is far from entertaining. 7 out of the 89 minutes that characters directly interact with each other in this game is this scene. And if they were willing to throw this in there, I'm just so confused why we couldn't also have actual characters talking to each other in the present, in the story that we're actually trying to tell. Also, it is extremely distracting to me that this supposedly was filmed the day before, and the live-action Alan has thick stubble, but our hungover digital Alan does not, and then the Alan in the cinematic moments later has stubble again. Back in the present day, Alan knows somehow that he has to get the clicker back to the lake, so that he can use it to defeat the darkness for good. No clue how he learns this. He tells Barry, Sheriff Breaker, and the Lamp Lady to stay behind while he goes and deals with this once and for all. On his way out, he clicks his newfound tool once, and suddenly it has turned daylight outside, the darkness temporarily dispelled. Alan then gets into a car and starts to drive in the direction of the lake, and we are given a really nice moment to just feel this world in the daylight and explore a little. But again, they are terrified of us having any downtime to just chill and enjoy what they've made it all and just relax. They don't understand what is compelling about the world that they have built. Me driving this car through these mountain highways is one of the single most enjoyable things in this entire experience, but they don't even let you do this for 3 minutes before it's back to shooting shadow people. Suddenly, the landscape changes into nighttime by will of the dark presence, and Alan is forced to battle the rest of his way to the cabin. I don't know why he didn't try and use the clicker again. It seemed to be pretty helpful for this exact purpose. I think it would have been great for there to be a recharge time on the clicker for this section, where an insurmountable amount of enemies are guarding these paths, and instead of defeating all of them, you're trying to buy time before you can click them away into daylight, so that you can continue on your journey. Could be a cool way to play with the light here, and also be thematically tied in with Alan's struggle of getting back to the lake, because you'd get extra time to see this place in the daylight, while also having it be tense as you know it's going to shift back to the night in mere moments. And additionally, that would have given them a chance to show off that dynamic day and night system that they developed, which isn't used anywhere in the final game outside of cinematics, where they show it off a ton. But despite that, this section is pretty great. The Dark Presence throws everything it has at Alan, and you fight more of the Taken here than any other chapter, as this is just one giant apocalyptic battle to the end. They even get to use the tornado that they designed for the open world here as the final boss battle. If you take the time to stop and explore, you can find this hotel, and in the hotel you can find the room that Agent Nightingale has been staying in while he's been in Bright Falls. And they use environmental storytelling to really flesh out his nature and obsession with catching Alan. You can learn more about him in this room than you do in any of the moments that he's actually present in scenes. This stuff is great, and I feel like they would have done this a lot more if the open world had survived this process. On the way to the lake, there is one moment where one of the Taken attacks you while driving a monster truck that has me wondering if this was in the original GTA concept, where there would have been a mission where Alan goes to a trucking event. You do have to remember this is a European studio making a game about a caricature of life in small-town America, and I can totally see a monster truck rally being appealing there for a fun one-off side mission. It's just a detail that really sticks out to me as being odd and out of place, because this is the only time you see this model, and that seems like a lot of work just for this one moment that in my campaign lasted about 3 seconds. There's also this bit where it seems like we're going to have a Resident Evil 4 style minecart section, but Alan gets in the cart and it peters forward slowly, and then 30 seconds later it stops and the ride is over, which is extremely underwhelming and makes me think they originally developed this to have a much longer section that got scrapped there at the end, because this is the only time you ever see anything like this, and it feels weird to design a functioning minecart track if this is all that you're going to use it for. As far as the story is concerned, this chapter has little that works for me, as it is just one long stretch of fighting to the cabin, followed by a series of events that, at least to me, do not make a lot of sense, either logically within the series of events, or emotionally as an ending for this character and this story. After killing the tornado, Alan is mentally transported back to New York, with the Dark Presence taking the form of Panty Alice to try and trick him into not killing it. Alan then uses the clicker, and Thomas Zane in his diving suit floats into the room, revealing himself to Alan as the voice of God who has been contacting him the whole time. It is also implied that Zane is a character in Alan's manuscript, and that, if I understand it correctly, through creation they both birthed each other into existence. Thomas Zane later appears in 2019's Control, and pretty much everything about him in this game is retconned, where he's now a filmmaker and not an author, and takes the form of a second doppelganger to Alan, presumably to set up the events of the upcoming Alan Wake 2. Alan also in the darkness meets his doppelganger, Mr. Scratch, who serves literally no purpose for this ending or this scene, and is only here so that he can smile at Alan and they can mirror the famous ending scene of Twin Peaks Season 2. They also rip this scene again for Control where Jessie fights her doppelganger. They even include their version of the mirror speak from Twin Peaks. They just keep shamelessly being raccoons, sorting through Lynch's garbage in the dead of night. Alan then sticks the clicker into the empty chest cavity of the dark presence, and when he clicks it, it explodes into light that shoots out of her eyes and mouth, which is actually a pretty great visual. Alan then ends up being trapped in the lake, trying to write a new manuscript to escape the darkness. Alan Wake just stops there with no resolution to its main story, themes, or ideas, on a cliffhanger that, unlike Twin Peaks, is not explained enough for us to care and be excited to see what they do next. In the case of Twin Peaks, they were cancelled after their famous cliffhanger ending. This was fully intended to be explored in the proposed Season 3, and wasn't some weird commentary on endings. In the process, Alice is saved, waking up and swimming out of the lake, giving us one last time to look at her panty model, which I'm pretty sure by the end of the game has about as much screen time as her clothed counterpart. We then fly bird's eye view over the Deer Festival, as all of our friends that we made along the way that we never actually got to know very well dance and celebrate. And in the background, the dark presence watches from the diner window somehow still alive. To me, pretty much none of this works, nor is it earned. Walmart brand Lynch. For this chapter, final daylight time is 12 minutes, nighttime 61 minutes. Total citizens of Bright Falls killed, 72. Some would say that what I have said is not true, and that Alan Wake does have an actual ending. They did release 2 different DLC chapters that take place after this, that serve as the true ending to the game's story, but I've never played these. I know this is probably controversial for some reason, but I think that DLC should be judged on its own merits, and a game should be reviewed based on the content that ships on the disc. So by that logic, I consider Alan Wake to not have an actual ending. I essentially never buy downloadable content. Bloodborne is one of my favorite games of all time. I've played it at least 10 times, but I've never touched the Old Hunters DLC pack. In this particular instance, I think it is pretty gross to release a clearly unfinished game slapped together at the last minute about the importance of story, and then have the gall to charge $14 to get the end of that story, which I assume doesn't actually wrap up a lot of the loose ends or answer many questions. One of their biggest inspirations was lost after all. But I suppose there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear, and the unanswered mystery is what stays with us, and what we will remember in the end.